In the summer of 1916, deep within the Russian Empire, a catastrophe began, one that people tried to forget for almost a century. What was intended as a simple mobilization for rear area work turned into a bloody rebellion and a mass escape through the mountains. The uprising spread across thousands of kilometers, from Kujan to Semirechye, from Turgai to the Pamirs. Some burned settler villages, while others took revenge with a cruelty worthy of an empire. The reasons seemed clear, but the consequences turned out to be much more terrifying. This was not just a reaction to the decree, it was a protest against the entire structure of colonial power in the Russian Empire. And its price was tens of thousands of lives lost and the shattered lives of entire peoples. I was prompted to talk about this topic by an interesting conversation with a resident of Kyrgyzstan. This episode is about an event that still divides memory and silence. Here, I'm not afraid to discuss uncomfortable topics that Russian propaganda tries hard to keep quiet about. So subscribe if you want to know what really was behind the phrase uprising in Turkestan. My name is Semyon. This is the Mega Show TV channel. Let's get started. Исторический контекст. Central Asia became part of the Russian Empire relatively recently, in the middle and late 19th century. From 1860 to 1890, Russian troops rapidly advanced south, taking control of the lands of modern Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. Обоснование российской экспансии было простым. Any Russian person will still tell you this today. The British Empire was supposedly already approaching the region's borders from India, so we were forced to enter into a covert confrontation with London for dominance in Central Asia. However, nothing new here. The conquest of these territories, of course, did not happen peacefully. The subjugation of the Kokand Khanate alone cost thousands of lives. The Kievan Khanate and the Bukhara Emirate were turned into vassals, losing their fertile lands. Then came the land surveyors, officials, and most importantly, settlers. Between 1906 and 1912 alone, nearly 500,000 Christian families from central Russia were resettled in the territory of what would become Kazakhstan. The arriving peasants were given up to 30 desyatinas of land per male family member. That's 10 times more than in Russia itself. Land for them was taken from the local population, primarily from the nomads whose winter pastures were seized. The administration of the new region was formally autonomous. In 1886, a regulation on the administration of the Turkestan region was adopted, according to which the Governor-General had broad powers. But in reality, this did not work. There was one official for every 23,000 residents. Most administrators did not know the local languages or customs. Their task often became not maintaining order, but personal enrichment. Problems had to be solved through the courts of Bais and Kazis. They were often corrupt and biased. The administrative system was thoroughly weak, ineffective, and was perceived as foreign, unjust, and sometimes even hostile. Causes of the uprising? However, the key changes began in 1914 with the Russian Empire's entry into World War I. For a backward, agrarian, and multi-ethnic power, this was not just an external conflict, but a test of the entire system's strength. The longer the war went on, the more acute the shortage of resources became, including manpower. After all, they were used to fighting not with skill, but by throwing bodies at the enemy. Therefore, by 1916 it became clear, without mobilizing new contingents, the front would not hold. And then the authorities in St. Petersburg decided to take a step that would turn out to be one of the bloodiest mistakes of the Tsarist regime. The key reason for the start of the uprising was the decree of Nicholas II from June 25, 1916. The document required the average male population to go to rear area labor in the frontline areas. Will turn out to be one of the steps for St. Petersburg and St. Petersburg. This is not about military service, but about digging trenches, building roads. But for the peoples who had been exempted from military service for centuries, this sounded like betrayal. They remembered that one of the incentives for joining the empire was exemption from military service. Now these promises were broken. And why? Am I not surprised? But the decree was just the match. The pile of firewood itself was the accumulated socio-economic tension. The nomads were losing their pastures, the settled peasants their water and land, lands were being taken for the needs of settlers, and livestock was being requisitioned. During the war years, taxes doubled, especially on cotton, and from 1915 a military tax was also introduced for the region. People were already living under an emergency levy regime, and then another summons arrived. The situation was further aggravated by the cultural divide with the local population, who were referred to as non-Russian natives. They had no political rights, did not serve in the administration, their clergy were not officially recognized, and the elite, descendants of Genghis Khan's line and elders of the mullahs, were not integrated into the state system. They were not subjects in the full sense of the word, but rather taxpayers. The state took but gave nothing in return. Even a formally reasonable decree was implemented in the most careless way possible. It was published in the midst of Ramadan and the agricultural season, two sacred and vital periods. The lists of those to be mobilized were compiled by officials and local bai, so mainly poor people ended up there, while wealthy families' sons easily bought their way out. A bribe for exclusion from the list could reach up to 300 rubles, an amount that a person would normally earn in over a year. All of this led to rumors, fear, and panic. People believed that they would be used as a human shield between the trenches of the Russians and the Germans of the empire. She opened Pandora's box, but perhaps she didn't even realize what exactly she had unleashed. I don't know about you, but I even have some kind of déjà vu from Ukraine. The Russian Federation has seized pieces of Ukrainian territory, steals everything from grain to energy, and in one way or another exploits the population in the same way. What's most disgusting is that through propaganda, the Russian Federation even sends many Ukrainians to war against their own people. This video is useful for those who are waiting for the Russian world. Let's return to the video's topic. The course of the uprising. It's not surprising that the uprising first broke out in the south in July 1916, with Kujan becoming the center of the initial unrest. It was here, according to legend, that a woman named Kadimi Jamalak tried to save her son from being drafted. She grabbed a saber from a policeman, which triggered a chain reaction that spread throughout all of Turkestan. The uprising quickly spread to Jizak, Tashkent, Kokand, and other cities of the Fergana Valley. The main targets of the rebels were officials, policemen, and settlers. Strikes were carried out against symbols of imperial power, and as a result, there were attacks on Russian settlements, which for some reason appeared only after the colonization by the Russian Empire. In response to the attack, Cossack units and army units were sent to the Jizak district. According to official data, about 5,000 people were killed, not only rebels but also civilians, in Semirechye, on the territory of modern southeastern Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. The uprising was particularly fierce and spontaneous. Here, mass executions alternated with punitive raids, villages were burned, livestock was seized, and those suspected of participating in the rebellion were killed without trial. In the north, in the Turgai steppe, the situation developed differently. There, the uprising was more organized. It was led by representatives of the Kazakh nobility, Khan Abdugafar Jan Basinov, and the military leader Amangeldi Imanov. A council of commanders, Kanesh, was established, and even a unified tax was introduced to support the resistance. At its peak, up to 50,000 fighters were under Imanov's command. There were few Russian settlements in this part of the steppe. Apparently they hadn't had time to settle the area, so the conflict did not escalate into an ethnic massacre. The authorities were never able to completely suppress the Turgai stronghold. It lasted until the February Revolution. There was no overall coordination of the uprising. It wasn't a unified front or a planned campaign. It was dozens of local outbreaks of rage, triggered by a single order and fueled by decades of humiliation. The uprising lasted from July until the end of autumn in 1916. By October, the main centers in Turkestan and Semirechye had already been suppressed by punitive expeditions before the February Revolution. Some of the participants in the uprising joined revolutionary movements, while others were eliminated during the years of the Civil War. Overall, the authorities regained control over the region at the cost of tens of thousands of lives, destroyed villages, and the final destruction of trust between the peoples and the imperial center. Consequences of the uprising. The 1916 uprising quickly turned from a political protest into an ethnic tragedy. Russian settlers suffered during the uprising. It's interesting. How did they end up there? Be that as it may, in response, after the imperial troops were brought in, punitive detachments began to carry out pogroms in the settlements of the indigenous population. Russian units acted mercilessly. Hundreds of aisles were destroyed. Everyone died. Those who fought, those who sheltered Russians, and those who tried to stay out of it. The worst part was that after a real threat, collective punishment followed. The authorities took revenge not on specific participants, but on entire peoples. The most terrible episode was the tragedy of the Kyrgyz of Semurechye. Fleeing from repression, tens of thousands of families abandoned their property and escaped across the Tian Shan Mountains to China without food or shelter. In winter, this exodus would be called Urkun, the Great Exodus. By the most conservative estimates, and I want to emphasize, by the most conservative estimates, between 80,000 and 100,000 people died from hunger, disease, and attacks. For Kyrgyzstan, this is a national trauma, equal in significance to the Holodomor in Ukraine or the Holocaust in Europe. A new wave of resettlement followed the uprising. The Governor-General of Turkestan, Alexei Kuropatkin, proposed taking the best lands from the Kyrgyz and creating exclusively Russian settlements in their place. Although these plans were put on hold due to the revolutionary events of 1917, the logic of governance itself was already fully colonial. The political repercussions reached the State Duma itself. One of its prominent representatives, Alexander Kerensky, visited the region for an inspection and delivered a report that shocked even the capital's liberals. He accused the administration of governing Turkestan as if it were not part of the country, but a wild province. He called the mobilization decree insane and absurd, and described the actions of the army as systematic terror, unacceptable even in an Eastern despotism. The outcome of the campaign turned out to be the opposite of what was expected. Out of the planned 500,000 people for labor behind the lines, only about 120,000 were actually mobilized. Most of them were never sent to the European part of Russia. Some regions, for example Yakutia, managed to secure complete exemption from mobilization. The authorities got scared and backed down. But it was already too late. The region was on fire and the empire began to crack at the seams. Historiography and Memory. The historical understanding of the 1916 uprising turned out to be no less complicated than the events themselves. In Tsarist Russia, the topic was almost immediately presented in the spirit of treason and fanaticism. Muslim leaders, who were allegedly spreading pan-Islamist and pan-Turkist propaganda, were blamed. Mentions of Turkish spies regularly appear in archival documents, but most importantly, not a single piece of evidence of foreign involvement was ever found. And you know, later this myth turned out to be very convenient for the Soviet authorities as well. In the USSR, they framed the uprising as class struggle and a prelude to revolution in Marxist terms. However, this framework poorly explained the massive participation of the aristocracy, the clergy, and even those who had previously been loyal to the empire. On the other hand, to recognize the uprising as anti-colonial would mean to question the legitimacy of Soviet power in the region. Therefore, it was either discussed vaguely or with an ideological slant, avoiding uncomfortable topics such as interethnic violence. After the collapse of the USSR, a reassessment began in the countries of Central Asia. In Kyrgyzstan, the uprising became a symbol of national tragedy, with an official day of remembrance and museum exhibitions. In Kazakhstan, it is interpreted as part of the national liberation movement. In Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, this is discussed less, though interest is rising. What about the Russian Federation? In the Russian Federation, the scale of the tragedy is rarely discussed or acknowledged by few. But propaganda, of course, presents all this to its supporters as justification for punitive measures, as a so-called adequate response to the cruelty of the rebels. Well, perhaps the main thing that unites all approaches is the recognition of the scale. The 1916 uprising became the largest anti-colonial movement in the history of the Russian Empire. Заключение. Conclusion. The 1916 uprising is not just a forgotten chapter somewhere on the outskirts of the Russian Empire. It is a vivid, painful cry of entire peoples who were robbed, humiliated, and deprived of their right to speak for centuries. This is not a rebellion for the sake of rebellion. It is a desperate attempt to save the remnants of dignity. The empire demanded submission, but gave nothing in return. No equality, no respect, no future. Behind its outward order lay systemic exploitation, violence, and contempt for the non-Russian peoples. And when this mechanism failed, it failed in such a way that the entire structure cracked. Today, more than 100 years later, we once again see our Russian state hiding behind the rhetoric of protection, invading foreign lands, taking, raping, destroying, and once again using some of its own people against others. Once again, it speaks on behalf of history, which it falsifies itself. But history does not forget. The 1916 Uprising is a direct historical indictment against that same imperial logic, which even today leads to wars, deportations, and ethnic hostility. It is a reminder that for every stolen land, for every oppressed people, for every lie, there will be an answer. Today, as Ukraine fights for its freedom, as Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, and Tatars remember how their grandfathers died at the hands of the Tsarist or Soviet army, we are obliged to speak about this openly, because silence is complicity. Memory is a weapon. Truth is resistance. This was a Mega Show TV broadcast. If you also feel it's time to speak openly, share this video. This is our history. And this is our answer. Thank you for your attention. Subscribe to the channel and support it financially through sponsorship or by sending a direct transfer via PayPal. Goodbye, everyone.